This is Andrea with Parking Lot Debrief. Okay, I'm excited to have my friend here. We've got Don Miller. Do you have a sign name?
I don't. Nope. I don't have a sign name.
Right.
Just spell my name.
Don, Don, it's short. Okay. So, the first CDI to come on the podcast. Very excited to talk about that today. Would you mind giving us just a short bio about yourself, who you are?
Sure. Exactly. Yep. I am a CDI. I've been doing that since 2017. And being deaf, I was actually born hearing and became deaf when I was 5. And in conversations with school and family, it was determined that I would stay in a mainstream setting, use listening, spoken language. So I was raised in that setting without any sign language exposure. I actually learned sign language when I went to Gallaudet, my freshman year at Gallaudet.
Later. Okay.
Yeah. And continued that learning process and decided to actually major in ASL and graduated with an ASL degree from Gallaudet. And while I was a Gallaudet student, I worked part-time as an interpreter as well, working with deaf-blind students in their different classroom settings. And that's where I started my interpreting journey. I graduated from there and went on to teach, and I've been teaching since. And then 2015, started interpreting again in the deaf-blind community, 2015, 2016. Decided to pursue certification in 2017 and have been interpreting since then. And so I continued to teach at the University of Texas, UT, and interpret part-time.
So, when you were teaching ASL or teaching students at a deaf school?
Yeah, so I've taught in a variety of settings. I taught at the Maryland School for the Deaf, where I taught elementary school for a few years, moved to New Mexico School for the Deaf, and worked in the outreach department there in that program, and then moved to Austin, Texas, and worked at ACC, Austin Community College, for about 8 years. Went back to work at Gallaudet University for several years, came back to Austin, and I've been teaching at UT and then interpreting.
Nice. I didn't know all these things about you. Cool. So the first thing that comes to mind as a certified deaf interpreter, are you through RID certified?
No, actually, I'm certified through BEI. Yeah,
BEI,
which is here in
Texas. Yes.
Texas. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I decided since I'm in Texas to take their training, and I'm just familiar with their program. And at that time in 2017, RID wasn't offering that testing. In 2017, they started testing again a few years after that, and so pursued BEI certification.
Can any deaf person become BEI, CDI certified, right? Anyone can take that test?
Hmm.
Is there
Yep.
special training or anything that people do?
Not really training per se, but they provide, demo model testing to see what the testing involved. They provide workshops. BEI throughout the year offers several workshops to help people prepare for the test. The test itself, there's an English component. I think it's called the Texas English. What's
T
it called?
yeah, TEP.
That's right, TEP, the Texas English
Proficient.
Proficiency
Yeah.
component. So once you've passed that, then you take the performance test. And the performance test is comprised of 4 different parts. One is from text into ASL. Another is ASL to a signed form of English. And then there are 2 other components to that performance test. Once you've passed all of those, you're certified with BEI.
What advice would you tell folks? And I know I've met so many DIs or worked with deaf people who I'm like, yeah, you would be good as a CDI, but everyone's very apprehensive and scared of NIC.
Hmm.
But I'm like, you got BEI, you can go that direction too. What advice would you say to kind of get them into this field?
Yeah, exactly. There are so many tremendously skilled DIs, deaf interpreters. The problem is the test itself is not really designed to test
Right.
their skill at interpreting, right? It just tests their knowledge of both languages. And whether or not that's the best approach to the test is, I think, there's some uncertainty. There needs to be a lot more research into the test itself because so many DIs are tremendously skilled and proficient. And so why
You
aren't they getting
need,
certified, right?
you need them.
You're right. And there are laws and requirements, and different, agencies have requirements that you have to be certified, and without certification, you can't provide interpreting. And so that certainly needs to be addressed. And it's worth discussing how we can get those individuals certified who are so skilled.
You are in Texas, go talk to them BEI folks. Say, come on, we got to
Right.
revamp this test.
For sure. I agree, Andrea. And right now, the board of BEI is all comprised of hearing members. And so they really don't have any idea what's involved in deaf interpreting, what that entails. There is actually one deaf person who just came on the board.
Good.
Yeah. And so this is the point at which they can be, I think, a catalyst to make the necessary changes to really elevate deaf interpreting. And oftentimes we wonder, why do we need deaf interpreters? We have plenty of hearing interpreters. And I
All
think
right.
really yeah,
All right. I
that's
was
the
going to
big
say,
burning
what's your
question.
elevator speech? What do you say to folks about
Right.
CDI?
Right. That's the whole point, right? Like just the cultural experience and the shared background with deaf individuals that we work with is so paramount. And there are great hearing interpreters out there, no question. But in
But
terms of that background, it's just not there. Many of them, learned ASL as a second language in college, later in life, and they don't have the language skills that are on par with someone who used the language natively from birth. It's just not the same. And so having a deaf interpreter engage in that setting with the expertise to know how to get the information that's coming, whether it's signed English or through ASL, and to make the necessary changes to make that something accessible to a client is really what deaf interpreting is all about.
the best way I've tried to explain it, I always try to think, okay, so how can I explain this to my mom? Someone maybe who just doesn't know how this works, but how would my mom understand this? And I say, so, for example, let's say Spanish interpreters. So this it was interpreter A, Spanish interpreter, grew up in Ohio, was English speaking majority
Mm,
of their life, learned Spanish in college and became an interpreter, and they're great. But then the people that this person is interpreting for are from Mexico. So let's then bring in an interpreter who then maybe grew up in Mexico, spoke Spanish their entire life. So you would choose that interpreter because they would fit this family much better. And
mhm.
that's something like my mom or like general public understands that those little nuances are there. So yeah, it's just the best way I can explain it.
For
So for
sure.
some reason, Spanish is a little bit more understanding. People understand that, what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
because they understand spoken language, right?
Right.
Whereas with sign, people think, "Oh, what's the big deal?"
Right.
Right? It's just sign, and it's a totally different thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do you typically work? What do you do? What type of work do you do?
So I'm a full-time instructor. And so I do interpreting part-time. And usually I'm doing a lot of virtual interpreting in virtual settings. So could be at the university level, research team, interpreting in that context, sometimes meetings, conferences, board meetings, doctor's appointments, and schools as well. Those are my primary settings I'm working in. A lot of CDIs, specialize in, let's say, the medical setting or educational setting or the legal field. I'm primarily in the educational and medical settings, and then working with the deafblind community as well. So in those spaces.
In person for hmm,
I would say a mix of both, actually, especially since COVID. I mean, there's been such an increase in virtual work. Prior to COVID, oftentimes it was all in person, being there on site and doing the work in that context. So there was a bit of a shift after COVID. But
same.
since COVID hit, the work available to deaf interpreters has really decreased.
You'd think opposite.
I know it, right? But it's really gone away. And I think that out there's a mindset that, okay, we'll just provide interpreters. That will be the bare minimum, and we'll be doing it virtually. And we're still looking into why that occurred, why we didn't take advantage of the opportunity to expand the use of deaf interpreters when we went into the virtual settings. It just didn't happen.
Where do you enjoy interpreting most? What is the most fulfilling type of work?
Hmm. Mhm. I would say working in the deaf-blind community and interpreting there. I mean, they're always doing something different, right? Like they're always, going to interesting places, going camping, let's say, or getting together in, social settings with each other. And I learn new things every day when I work with them. Especially in the deaf-blind community now, I would say since, let's say over the last 12 or 15 years, they've started to use protactile more and more,
Right.
protactile language.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, protactile language. So prior to then, deafblind folks were primarily using tactile ASL, so
Right.
feeling typical ASL. And two deafblind women created. protactile. And it's certainly more of, it puts them on equal footing. Users of Protactile, when they're communicating, are
Context,
on equal footing. Yeah. And historically, there was an inferiority to, someone who was communicating with the deaf-blind person was caretaking, getting them the information that they need, and to some extent, caretaking for them. And with Protactile, it allows equal footing. Uh,
independence. Yeah.
yeah, independence, exactly. Just a mutuality to, the teamwork of working together. And yeah, I really enjoy that a lot because it's still under development. It's not, an entire language yet. And so we're continuing to learn new ways to really let go of the visual aspects of ASL and put it into a tactile modality with that language. And I just really enjoy that mostly.
It's a whole other language. I have only scratched the surface of, I have very minimal
Yeah.
knowledge with that, but the things I've learned and seen, I'm like, so it's just a whole other layer and a whole other language. Well, so in those situations, are you typically working with a deafblind pa client that's sitting with you and then receiving the information from a presenter, a hearing interpreter, or what's the what's the source language you're getting that from?
Sure. I mean, it really varies depending on setting, right? I mean, I can think of a situation where, I was interpreting from a presentation to a deafblind individual. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's a completely different language, and the mindset, the mental task, the processing. It's like hearing interpreters, having to take in an auditory modality and then process that into ASL. Here, I'm taking ASL and processing it into a protactile, right? A totally,
Touch.
yep,
Yeah.
a tactile language, and it requires a lot of, um, there's a lot of information involved. So oftentimes we as deaf people, we're visual language users, and oftentimes we'll point to, in terms of pronouns in ASL and in Protactile, we can't point into the air, right? It's
Yeah.
totally pointless. So instead, we use a tactile means to set things up in space on the person's, let's say, forearm, to show who's talking or to show back and forth conversation kind of thing, rather than, having to explain, who's talking by pointing out in, random space. Everything then is tactile based in Protactile.
Interesting. Yeah. Let me see. So it just makes me think. I notice when I'm working or talk with DIs or CDIs, like you said, you're doing the process of interpreting, just like a hearing interpreter is interpreting from English to ASL. You're from ASL to protactile in that situation. So does a CDI have more of a deeper understanding for hearing interpreters because you understand the mental work and translation work of trying to figure out all of this information that needs to be interpreted to another language is fucking hard. And
It
it's
is.
like I notice when I talk with CDIs and DIs, um, just even or even as a deaf person, you guys understand the role of interpreters than just like the regular everyday deaf person.
You're right. I admit when I became certified, beyond that point, my hat really went off to hearing interpreters because prior to that, I was kind of mean
You were
to hearing
mean?
interpreters. I was like, come on, why can't you do this? Get
Ugh.
it right. I mean, what's it all about, right? But until I tasted that process for myself, it really gave me a sense of the work involved. That it's not just, facilitating between two languages, but, the tone, the emotion, the language itself, not to mention all of the elements that are happening beneath the surface of that facilitated communication brought me to a real respect for interpreters, the interpreting field in general, and the work that we all do. And so I think I do, yeah. Have taken a step back to realize that it's not just a thing I can jump in and say, "Oh, this is easy. I'll just do this." It requires a lot of training. You have to figure out how to work with people to find ways that will be effective in terms of working with a team, not to mention the client as well, and making that all come together seamlessly. It's certainly not easy. It's messy. It's organic. And each setting, something comes up, it's new,
Yeah.
something emerges. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? And we as interpreters, when something arises, we can't say, oh, okay, this is the end of the world. I'm a terrible interpreter. I'm going to leave the field, right, and find another vocation. It's just a part of the job. It's an element of the job. Something's always going to arise or emerge, a conflict with another person that you have to work together to resolve. Um, right? And it's an evolving field, career as well. It's not, just
In its
black and white.
infancy.
It is in its infancy,
Just
right?
started. I mean, I feel like we're just figuring out, okay, we know how to do this, right? It feels like
Yeah.
we're just in the last, what, 20 years, it feels still new
Hmm. Right. And did you learn sign language later in your life?
at 19.
At
Yeah.
19. And so have you ever had the sense of, okay, I've arrived, I know everything I need to know as an
No,
interpreter,
no, never.
right?
Language.
And
I mean,
that's
it's
one thing I do
language.
see. Yeah, 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 right. Exactly, Andrew. I mean, and I don't always see that in everyone I encounter. I
Yep.
see some interpreters who just sort of clock
Yep.
in, I show up, I do the work I normally do,
Yep.
and it's the status quo. I plateaued.
Good enough. It makes me crazy.
Oh, me too. I mean, why are you in the field? Right? This work is work. We have to do the
We're not
work
robots. Yeah.
every day. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so, yeah.
It sometimes I think that it's uncomfortable. I think
Mhm.
back when I worked, at the mall. It was kind of brainless work. I didn't really have to think too hard about stuff, just doing my job. But sometimes I miss that mindlessness of it was an easy job I could have a hard day at and I could just move through it. But interpreting, you're on
Hmm.
always. There's some jobs that are kind of mindless. You can just interpret and kind of stay in that neutral zone. But I'd say 80, 90%, we have to be paying attention. We have to be
Hmm.
on. We have to be feeling it out and feeling the room.
Oh,
Agreed.
totally. And you have to take care of yourself as
Yeah.
well to be in this field. I mean, if
Priority.
you have, life turmoil happening and you show up and you bring that onto the job site, it's going to affect the work that you do,
Yep.
you know, and people may not see it, but you're going to feel it. And I'm not 100% present, which means you have to really back up and take care of yourself. And that might mean different things for different folks. I mean, some people it's going out for a walk, other people it's getting a massage, some people do yoga, some people make sure that they're eating right, that kind of thing.
Sleep.
So right, yeah, getting enough sleep, exactly. And drinking too much coffee, right? Sometimes,
Anxious.
oh yeah, you drink too much coffee and you're like, ah, I'm all jittery, and like that causes a breakdown.
And I think I mean, we are not therapists by any means,
Yeah.
but we have to show up in those jobs centered and grounded
Hmm.
and ready as it like therapists. Your shit
Hmm.
has to be left at the door, show up and then you can pick your stuff up when you leave that assignment.
Yep.
But I talk with Michelle too. We talk about in that episode same for you as a CDI. I feel like there's an even added extra layer of personal aspect to it. Uh, Personal as in yourself and personal as in your relationship with those people that you're working with. They probably know you. You probably
Hmm.
know everyone in that context. It's even a smaller community than my circle. So just that added layer of gotta be professional, gotta have them boundaries type of thing.
Oh, for sure. You're right. I mean, in terms of the community, people know who I am. I'm a part of different, deaf community events, organizations. I work at, UT, I work at Gallaudet, and so, ACC. And so those folks see me in the variety of settings, and it's like I really have to be cautious and careful about the boundaries that I draw and make sure that, my role is very clear in a given setting. Sometimes I'll go to a conference, let's say, and I'm working with a deafblind person and people will compensate. Oh, hey, Don, yada yada yada, right? Like, oh, let's
Interrupt.
chat. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm
You're
like,
like, ah,
well,
working.
bingo. Yeah, I'm working right now. I can't talk now, and I'll finish the work, and I'll go back to the person and say, oh, I'm sorry. When I'm working, I'm really focused and tuned in. I can't be Don. I have to be an interpreter in that context or a co-navigator working with that person. And there's no clear line per se for many of us to navigate that.
Hearing interpreters, I feel like there are boundaries that
Yeah,
obviously get flexed, but CDIs, I feel like these even more of an ambiguous boundary line because I mean the
you're
job
right.
itself
Right.
lends itself to that type of thing.
Yes. Yeah, I'm a deaf person too, right? Just like the people I'm
Right.
working with. And so I'm interpreting for them and I am a part of the community. And so they might want to high five or fist bump. And I'm like, I really need to draw a boundary there in this context. I mean, I do understand what your intentions are, but
Right.
when I'm at work, I draw clear boundaries. And again, like we had mentioned, this field is in its infancy. And we're still finding where that sweet spot is in terms of boundaries, in terms of where we show respect for different roles.
And deafblind community users of those different modalities are also new and figuring that all out with
Hmm.
CDIs. So,
Right. And there's a bit of a stigma attached to using deaf interpreters. I mean,
yeah.
lots of deaf people think, oh, why do we need I don't need a deaf interpreter. I understand the hearing interpreter just fine. And it's like, yes, okay, but
And
think about, right, all of the members of the deaf community, deaf people who haven't had access to English growing up, perhaps experienced language deprivation or didn't have the privilege of knowing or having access to English. And that's where deaf interpreters come in, right?
I do notice more and more,
Yeah.
obviously, the mainstream deaf students, not all,
Mm,
many are obviously experience language deprivation throughout their childhood. Then they graduate, go out in the real world, and are expected to function and understand interpreters. They don't have their K-12 interpreter, and I show up and I notice, okay, uh, and it's not to say I have to lower my language in a sort of way or that they're less than. No, it's not at all. It's just those little tiny things that are missing in there that I, as a hearing interpreter, may miss and not even see.
mhm.
I may even see it, but I don't even know what to do about it. How do I
Yeah,
explain this? You know?
right. I mean, for mainstream K through 12 settings, I mean, oh, it's like that's where we need deaf interpreters.
Oh,
Let's
that'd be
send
the
them there,
best. That'd be the
right?
best ever.
Exactly.
Every
Yeah, yeah,
single
yeah.
one have. Can we start that?
Yeah, right? I mean, that's where we need
Ah,
them. It makes perfect sense. Because
language
even
model.
me, yeah, in a K through 12 setting growing up in a public school, in a hearing environment, I do have some understanding of, spoken listening and spoken language. And if I'm there as a deaf interpreter, even if a hearing interpreter isn't there, I can still facilitate a
Figure
lot
it
of what
out.
needs to happen,
Yeah.
what needs to be learned in the social aspect, right? In that setting. It's just there's
But the
resistance.
next big push, come on.
Yep. There's just huge resistance to the use of deaf interpreters. It's just true. And
Well,
it just depends on where.
right. Schools will barely put an interpreter in there, period. That's fight
Right.
number one, I imagine.
Right, exactly. And it's all about finances, budget, right? I mean, if we talk about sending two interpreters, a deaf and hearing team,
Right.
all day to a classroom, it's like many schools are going to say, yeah, no, we don't have the funding to send two. And so, I mean, in a ideal utopian world, everyone would be signing in that
Right.
environment,
Of
right?
course.
Yeah, everyone would be signing. But, that's the challenge that we face at this point. But I'm optimistic as well because um, I think information is getting out there. I think exposure to understanding about the role of deaf interpreters, even hearing
Mhm.
interpreters, are, yeah,
More and more
when there's
accepting.
resistance, like, why do we
There
need deaf
used to be
interpreters?
resistance.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that resistance decrease. And it depends on where we're talking about. I mean, here in Austin,
Right.
people are saying, yeah, let's work with deaf interpreters. Hearing interpreters are on board. And most of them prefer working with deaf interpreters at this point because they recognize, well, I'm up here signing and I'm not sure if what I'm doing is effective when I work with a deaf interpreter. It can just be the sort of, they help make certain that it's effective and the interaction is effective.
Honestly, I trust deaf folks and deaf interpreters when they say they receive resistance from hearing interpreters, but I yet to encounter a hearing interpreter who says I don't want to work with a CDI. I mean, honestly, I would love for someone to say that so I can check them and say some shit, but I
You're
haven't,
ready for
right?
them.
I just haven't. And I'm like, are you that insecure with yourself? That type of thing. But
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah, I think everything, that resistance behind resistance and all that is fear,
Hmm.
always.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely it's fear of, losing employment, losing their job, being evaluated, like,
You
oh, you're
think I
lousy.
can't do this.
Right.
Right.
Being looked down upon and all those things. And it's like, no, it's not. It's about the client. It's about their needs, right? Forget about yourself for a minute. Just set yourself aside and let's focus on the needs of the client and the setting, right? If you can provide what they need, great. But if it's not sufficient, and sometimes it's not, and it's nothing personal, like don't take that personally. That's not what it's about. And in this type of job, you have to be thick-skinned, right? I know some people who are very blunt, and I think that that's good, very forthright. And you have to be thick-skinned enough to see that this is a growth opportunity, a learning opportunity to realize like, let's shift perspective a bit, not just say, oh, it's my way or the highway all the time, right?
Right.
And because then you're not going to grow, you're just going to plateau.
Well, and we're not a fit for everything. And I honestly don't want to be fit for everyone and everything. Ugh.
Hmm.
I don't want to be. Yeah.
Yep.
And then I thought, because the first thing I said was you're giving the perspective of, I mean, you say you tip your hat to hearing interpreters or interpreters. You have that grace, but at the same time, you also understand the process and role of interpreters. So I just imagine you also may experience some frustration because you can see, okay, I know how this works. You got to do your job right, because you know now the process behind. You've seen behind the curtains of like what actually we're doing. You know what I mean? So allowing that grace and flexibility because you understand, but I also imagine you may feel like there's some frustration sometimes because you know when we're
Hmm.
doing our job good or not.
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, I think some people mean well, but it's like, okay, let's do the work. You need to do the work, right? I mean, same as me. I need to do the work to unpack my old ways of thinking, my outdated beliefs when it comes to, hearing interpreters in general, that applies too. Make sure that, it's not about me. It's not about you personally. It's about the job. It's about the work and providing quality, right? Equivalent messaging to a person that as if there was no interpreter involved. That's really the goal,
Yep.
right? Is to get them information as if there wasn't an interpreter, whether there's an interpreter or not.
It's funny because the theme that keeps coming up, I'm telling you, with every episode that I'm recording with folks is often we're not even talking about or even bringing up the concept of improving the sign language skills. Of course, we have to. But what often is coming up is unpacking your shit, figuring out yourself. No, I noticed that that plays more of a role of messing up a situation than someone who's maybe not the best signer or interpreter. It's interesting.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. That's why I like this podcast concept because it gives interpreters an opportunity to learn from each other, from other people.
Hopefully.
Because when we show up on jobs, oftentimes we don't have time to debrief and unpack what we just did together, because, people are moving on to the next assignment, like pronto. And I think that this is nice to just sort of put some things on the table and talk about them, have some dialogue, have different perspectives on things. Maybe things that we never thought of before emerge that way.
That I'm hoping for is people leave from these episodes and just like the listeners take a nugget, just something
Hmm.
that they can keep in their pocket and use later. Maybe a way they can say something to someone or a way they act in a situation. That's my hope, I think. So, my next question here, let me see. What do you wish hearing interpreters understood about CDIs or knew more about or would pay attention to? Or, I guess, what do you want to kind of get across to hearing interpreters? I guess in general.
Right. Yeah. Generally speaking. I mean, I think, well, many hearing interpreters who I've worked with, they've learned about working with the deaf interpreter on the job, right? While it's happening.
True.
We're doing the work and we're learning how to do the
Yep.
work,
Yep.
right? What are we doing here? And it would be nice if more ITPs, interpreter prep programs, et cetera, um, went into greater detail about how to work with deaf interpreters and use deaf interpreters. I think more deaf interpreters also need training. I mean, right now there's so many ITPs that are focused on, hearing interpreting, and
Are
very,
there
very few
any?
schools. Yeah, none come to mind. I think of here in Austin Community College, they accept deaf students into the interpreter prep program, but it's still not
Yeah.
the focus, right? The focus, and it's a different skill set,
I
you
mean,
know,
Don, I guess
interpreting.
you're gonna just have to set up a program, man.
Yeah, that's something that I've talked about my school, at UT with. It's like, okay, where's this program
Yeah.
focusing on interpreting, deaf people interpreting? And what I wish that they knew more about deaf interpreting is really everything. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, again, this podcast is a perfect opportunity and venue for people to learn more about deaf interpreters and what and why they're there. Oftentimes, hearing interpreters are also thinking, why do we need a deaf interpreter? And many deaf interpreters who are very, they have the skills, But do they have the skills to, let's say translate? Many of them might just copy sign, right? Like just sign what the hearing interpreter is signing, and that's okay if you can make that work.
In the
It
situation.
depends on the situation. That's right. And you know, some situations, you have to do simultaneous interpreting. That's what you're doing, due to time constraints.
Right.
Whereas in other situations, consecutive interpreting is the absolute best choice, right? And you're using consecutive interpreting for a reason, and it's a perfect way of getting from English to a really pure ASL target message, because simultaneous interpreting, always the target language is going to intrude, and having that sense of, I mean, just having people realize, or I guess know, that many deaf interpreters don't necessarily have the training
Right.
to do that. They just have the instinct, right? They know what's missing. They know what information needs to be conveyed, but they don't have the training on how to do that necessarily. And mm, yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we would see, consistent teams. Oftentimes
Yes.
I work well with someone who I know, right? I know their style. I know the way that they sign things. And if I know that, it's way easier for me to work into ASL. And oftentimes we'll just, put random people together
Yep.
cold, like, okay, go for it. And, my mind is busy just figuring out what they mean, my team, and working so hard.
And me, same as a hearing interpreter. What do you
Yep,
need from me? Do you want me to lag more? Do you want me to be more English,
bingo.
more ASL? You want me to lag? Do you want me to hold these numbers?
Yep.
I mean, it's intimidating and difficult when we got to feel each other out, literally in that moment.
Right. And what, you know, uh, off the top of my head, what I think is important for interpreters, hearing interpreters to do is to know to look at me, right?
I
Like
mean,
oftentimes hearing interpreters will not be looking at me.
we do. We look around.
Um,
Eye contact for me is hard sometimes. Honestly, it's hard.
yeah. And I don't mean, stare me down, but it's like attend to what I'm
Yes.
doing and make sure that
Follow.
we're tracking each other, right?
Yeah.
Like oftentimes, I'll be signing something and looking away, and I'll miss, finger spelling from the hearing interpreter. I'll miss
Because
something.
I'm not looking at you.
That's
Okay.
it, right? And the hearing interpreter could instead say, okay, I'm going to hold this because I know Don wasn't looking at me. Make sure that he's looking at me when I give it to him. And then, have more of a flow, that concept. Because, I need to move my eyes just as a function of the language and then look back at the hearing interpreter and maybe, I missed something because of my lag. And that's just something that we need to figure out how to do better, is to find a way to, just keep that connection, the
Hmm.
timing of it, right? Yeah.
And what did I just do? It was a conference or something with a CDI recently. And after the process, I was like, ooh, exactly what you're naming is a skill in and of itself.
Hmm.
I'm listening to the English, interpreting it to the CDI while I'm also watching the CDI, you
Hmm.
understanding and taking your language in to make sure you're keeping up, but I'm also still listening to the English and interpreting.
Hmm.
All of that. Ooh, I'm noticing myself going, man, that's an added layer, a skill that like we don't even think about than just our regular interpreting. Now
Hmm.
my eyeballs also have to take in information and really how to get better is just practice.
Right,
Doing it over and over again and feeling that out and gauging what CDI needs in this moment. But if you don't do it often and I don't do it enough, I mean,
right,
if you're at a week-long conference, by the end you're
right.
comfortable and in it, but
Yep,
those one-off jobs, oof,
yep,
are
right.
hard.
Exactly. I can think of one situation that occurred. There were two hearing interpreters. There were plenty of other interpreters. And so they were working. One was watching me to make sure that I was
Nice.
tracking, and they were adding some things to what the other interpreter was offering,
Nice.
based on what I missed. And that was just ideal. It
I
was
mean,
so
yeah,
nice to have two feed interpreters. The other challenge is oftentimes, sometimes I think that we were working together in the past at one conference where there was a large audience, and the interpreters were seated very low. They're oftentimes in the front row.
and you're
And
looking down.
yeah, I'm looking down off the stage.
That
And
it doesn't
right.
work.
And I wasn't able to look at the audience at all. And so I lost the connection with the audience. There was one person in the audience, and I was just looking down at the interpreters off the podium. And so there wasn't enough space between us for me to be able to maintain a natural shift in eye gaze. I mean, my dream, and I think it's something that we already have, but I don't think it's actually in production yet, but are some glasses, almost like a hologram, that you could where you could see the interpreter no matter where my eye gaze is. So I
Nice.
could shift my eye gaze and continue to see the interpreter feeding the message as if I'm presenting rather than interpreting. I mean, that's a pipe dream, right? And
I
if that
think
could
they have
happen,
them.
oh my gosh, you know, all the interpreters, hearing interpreters could then stay home. I could
Fine with
just go out with
me.
my hologram glasses, right? You could be in your pajamas, working virtually
Sure.
into the hologram glasses. And I mean,
I
can you
mean,
imagine?
it would be even helpful with deafblind. You're facing the deafblind client
Yes.
versus having to see the people in front of you to
Yep.
interpret. Man,
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so
yeah.
I am excited that that's something that I think, will happen down the road. And, you know, who knows? If a person could just appear in my field of vision as a hologram.
Right. You yourself, Don, goes to a doctor's appointment and you can just see an interpreter in your
Yes,
glasses, and I don't have to be there.
right.
And I do know of a company, honestly. I know Sign Glasses. It's an agency and a company. They have them. I'm not sure that they're used
And I think it's
widely.
captions, though.
It's a little square with interpreter. Yeah, this was a few
Really?
years ago it came out. I'm not sure that it's
Huh,
out there yet though, but if folks actually use it. But
huh.
yeah.
The only one I know of is HearView,
Oh
and
yeah.
that produces captions. And there are
Captions.
pros and
Yeah.
cons to that, right? I mean, the deaf community has responded in a mixed way to that. But the point is, um, like how, how do the hearing people communicate then back to us? And
I mean, I'm surprised we don't have the glasses like you're saying. I'm also surprised, what does Gallaudet, do they not have a CDI program?
right?
Of
No,
all places, I would imagine they
right?
maybe.
Yeah. I mean, right now, all of the professors in the interpreting department, I want to say 95% of them are hearing. And so they don't have, the skill to teach deaf interpreting. And we need deaf interpreters to be brought in to
Right.
teach deaf interpreting. And right now, most of us get our training through a variety of programs. I mean, like Sorensen.
They have. Okay.
Yeah, they provide a DIA, Deaf Interpreter Academy, and it's free.
Nice.
Yeah, in 2019, I took part in that, and it's nice. It's a 6-week online program, and then ended up going to Utah for a week. And it is really nice, right? There's a lot of training involved, mock interpreting practice settings, making sure that people, in the
But
deaf
just
community,
6 weeks.
yeah, right. And it's a good, you know, light training, but there are other programs as well,
It's
right?
not a 2 to 4 year program.
Right. And there are other programs like that of deaf interpreters who are establishing their own training programs. Most of those are online, virtual. And so I think that it's growing, but we need that at the university level, at the college level, that type of training. And there's no one school that's providing deaf interpreter training to speak of. They all will take deaf students in the interpreting programs, but that's different.
And I teach an interpreter training program, and I have no business on even beginning to think about how to
Mhm.
teach CDIs.
Right. And how to work with deaf interpreters as hearing interpreters, right? They teach that, but actually teaching deaf interpreting is not happening.
Right.
And that's not okay. Yeah.
I only know how to hear information audibly and interpret it into ASL and vice
Hmm.
versa, but it's a whole
Right.
different skill that CDIs are doing.
Right.
Spe
And you mentioned that you teach as well?
yes, I
Or used
have.
to
I mean,
in the
online, but
past.
COVID was great, and then they were keeping their own in-state
You're
folks.
teaching interpreting?
Just the interpreting aspect
Hmm.
of the, yeah, like transliteration and or expressive working into English type of classes. But yeah, it's all audio based. This is the way I know how to teach and learn. So,
Yeah.
and you teach ASL,
Hmm.
and I know UT doesn't have an interpreter training program itself.
Nope.
So
That's right.
those students are just taking ASL as a minor or a language credit.
Right. As a language requirement, to meet the
Okay.
language requirement.
Which
It's
is a
funny because
different
most of
feeling.
them, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because most of my students in the program are audiology students or
Right.
speech language path.
That's good.
It is nice. It is nice.
They should be
Yeah.
able required to take it.
Yeah. To get that exposure, right? I mean, and their attitude has been good. I mean,
Giving them feeling
compared
good.
to, where it's been historically, from the audiology field and speech language pathology, where almost nobody signed in those fields. Um, But now I see more and more of those folks, audiology students, speech language pathologists signing, and so that's really nice to see. There are a lot of deaf people, who, use their voice and use, listening as well. And there's nothing wrong with that, but being able to communicate with your audiologist, your speech therapist makes sense, right? So to be able to use ASL also to explain the articulation of words, how
Mhm.
you pronounce words rather than having to feel the person's neck or chin or whatever, right? In terms of enunciation. It's nice to be able to use ASL to
Yeah.
show using classifiers what's happening inside the mouth and to the articulation of what you have to do that isn't sound based. And it's fun too, right? For some of us really enjoy that kind of detail. Why not have ASL be a part of that? Without it, it can be a real struggle to understand what's happening in terms of speech. Yeah. So again, I think universities and colleges need to get something in place tied to this. I mean, I feel that that will certainly help the interpreting field writ large, right? Become a stronger ally, become more, collectivist rather than, siloed, and divided. And it can, I think we need to get rid of that whole mentality and we need to work more collaboratively as a field.
Because setting up a program to train CDIs, you're going to need multiple CDIs to set
Mhm.
that up and teach. And if it's at one university that's kind of stuck in one space, and I know online learning and training is not always the best or easiest, but it does open it up to the nationwide. Yeah, Austin or DC. I mean, yeah,
One of those two, right? I say Austin.
yeah,
I'm here.
I
Bring it
know.
on. Yeah, right. But yeah, and we could work, across universities,
Right.
yeah, in tandem with each other. I've been in discussions with University of California, UCLA. I've had a friend who teaches ASL there, and we've been in discussions about partnering, working together across campuses, have students go back and forth and do something.
So I was thinking, so I've met many deaf people who want to become a DI or CDI, but who am I to judge? But I'm like, your ASL skills, you lean more English. Or so with a CDI program, would it require some sort of like ASLPI or
Sure.
ASLPE or some type of like screening or to formal ASL classes to get folks there? I imagine some area folks
Right.
need help with those areas.
Right. And you're right. And it's a challenge because ASL is oftentimes not taught to deaf students in the
Right.
K through 12 setting, right?
Mainstream especially.
Yeah. Hearing people are all excited, yay, I'm going to take ASL. And then deaf students are like, oh, no, we shouldn't teach them ASL. It's
And
like,
some deaf
oh, wait a
schools
minute. That's an
do.
irony, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
some deaf
some
schools
do.
have.
You're right. I know that the Texas School for the Deaf does teach their students ASL, but I mean, the problem is state requirements, right? And state testing. There's no ASL that's requirement. I mean, we talk about English, science, math, social studies, those being the core requirements. And so we need to add ASL to that. So schools recognize and realize the need to have ASL instruction for all grades, not just, and typically what happens from what I've seen is that, the high performing students get, ASL access, ASL course access. We need
Right.
to provide that to all deaf students instead because it's their right, right? It's their
Their language.
birthright to know
Right.
and understand their own language, right? And that comes down to, a deaf person who isn't as proficient as ASL, if they would go into one of these programs, again, having the ASLPI be a screening tool, and that school being willing to open up to some ASL classes, a crash course, let's say,
Yeah.
because oftentimes it's about time, right? 1 year of ASL immersion, and then a second and third year that's focused on interpreting instruction, that kind of thing. But you're right, we really need that.
Classifiers and things like that.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of deaf folks who, naturally, they already are interpreters themselves for their
Hmm.
friends or their family members. That
Hmm.
happens naturally for them. Um, but yeah, that the formal aspect of it. Okay, so you know how to interpret for this other friend, but the variety of deaf people you're going to run into as a professional and the
Yeah.
situations, the content you're going to be interpreting for, the concept of consecutive or simultaneous interpreting is a whole different ball game. Yeah,
Right. And I really want to emphasize that, you know, you, you don't have to necessarily be fluent in English.
right.
I mean, I don't think so. I think, having fluency, people misconstrue that you have to be equally fluent in both languages. You have to be fluent in one of them, certainly, and be able to take information and convey
Yes.
it between the two. right? To create a foundation. I myself, I mean, I feel very proficient in both ASL and English, but I do feel less fluent in one versus the other. And
Oh,
nobody is
same.
equally fluent in both. Yeah,
ASL is definitely lower line than English.
right. And I don't think anybody has that, perfect balance, when they go into a program. But if they're motivated and have the right attitude and have the potential to learn and they're teachable, come on in. You're you'd be more than welcome to that program.
Right, with like TEP for the BEI, is that a barrier? For hearing
Yeah.
interpreters, that's a barrier for, it's a hard test
Uh-huh.
for hearing interpreters. So I imagine it may be hard for deaf folks to take the English proficiency. And CASLI, the national test, they have heavy English like knowledge portion. That can be a challenge. The ethic portion as well has some English. Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting because the BEI didn't test my knowledge of, the CP, what is it called? The Code of Conduct.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That
same with
wasn't a
my
component.
BEI, just the
Yeah.
TEP and my sign skills.
Right. Right. It focuses on just language skills, whereas CASLI has more of, the gamut of,
Knowledge, yeah.
yeah, right. And so I'd be curious, I've been wondering about CASLI myself. I haven't taken it,
And they
but I
have
know
a
some folks who have.
CDI. That's on hold for a while, I know. It's back?
No, yeah, they've opened it up. Yeah,
Okay.
I know several friends in the interpreting community who have taken that CASLI certification test, and they've said, "Whew, it really made them sweat." I mean, they had to really train for it to take the test.
And it's freaking pricey.
It's so, you're right. I mean, for me, you know, whereas I grew up, learning how to take a test, test taking skills. Like
Yep.
taking a test is a skill in itself. Okay, you've got
Yep.
the knowledge, but those are totally different skill sets to get the knowledge versus take a test. So knowing how to take a test
Yep.
is a part of it and to
Beneficial.
pass. Yeah,
Perk for you.
right. It's not necessarily even about knowledge. It's about knowing how to be a test taker, right? And so that's something else that I think we really need to address and repair is because I don't want people not knowing how to take a test and have that be a barrier. But, they know how to facilitate language. Yeah.
Yeah, this makes me excited about like a CDI program getting set up someday.
Mm-hmm.
It just has a lot of thoughts going of like, I mean, what just having a pipeline of graduates of CDI, that would just be awesome.
Right.
Yeah,
And there's so many deaf people,
so many.
right, who would be amazing CDIs, but they're like, oh, no, 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 no,
Right.
not for me. Nope. Right. I mean, I've got my field I work in, and that's my preference. But imagine them coming into this field. It would be so remarkable. It's like, come on, right? But not everyone wants to be an interpreter.
I know.
You have to be, and we have to be okay with that.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I guess my last question here, in general, what are some common challenges that you face, whether that's during the assignment to even get the assignment itself, or just in general, what are challenges for CDIs that are out there?
I think off the top of my head, there's just not enough CDIs. I mean, I get requests on a daily basis,
You
and
do get
most of them I
requests.
have to turn down. Yeah,
Oh,
I do. Yeah. I mean, I'm already working usually, right? I'm either teaching or already interpreting, and I think,
I hear the
and
opposite.
COVID, sure.
Right. I know a lot of CDIs or DIs. I mean, it could be a DI who's just think, oh, there's no work at all. They're not
Mhm.
getting anything. I said, there's so much out there.
Yeah, I think I hear both of those. I think prior to COVID, there were plenty. I mean, we were all working, right? We were all working together and being mutually supportive of the work. When COVID hit, uh, people had to
Yeah.
go to a different jobs. I mean, literally couldn't continue that work, and so I think it dwindled the pool of DIs and CDIs as a result. And so I think that we're still seeing the lingering effects and we haven't resolved those yet. And hopefully we can get back to a place where, you know, there are a number of interpreters and, there's a pool of interpreters to get every job covered. Um, yeah. And I would say hearing interpreters not being afraid to ask for a deaf interpreter and just go for it, right? I mean, I've worked with some who are very assertive about that, about getting a deaf interpreter, and they always do it by by habit, so I want to push hearing interpreters to do that too. Um, we just need to push. The word will get out there.
Mhm.
It'll continue to spread and we'll grow the pool as a result.
Yeah, the asking has become easier, at least more comfortable of recognizing the situation needs a CDI. The resistance is a little bit less, and we're asking more. And my work with CDIs, I mean, are more mental health, medical, or conferences. Yeah.
Hmm.
And all of those are in which they're all hard in their own ways in those settings. Simultaneous interpreting, bless you. I don't know how y'all do it. It's sometimes I think, is this the best use of a CDI? Because you can't do your job justice. You can't do the best you can by me throwing info at you and you having to get it out as fast as possible. You just don't have enough time to do your magic. So yeah, it depends on the situation, obviously, and the information and context. But yeah,
Sure. I think one thing that comes to mind immediately is I think sometimes hearing interpreters think, okay, we brought in a DEI and that's going to solve all the problems. When in
right.
fact, that's not what we're about. I mean, for me, in mental health fields, I pass those by because I don't have any background in mental
Yeah.
health, right? And I would fail the client as a result, right? That doesn't feel right to me. I want to make certain that the person who's brought in has some background knowledge in that field or that setting. And oftentimes I get requests for, legal related interpreting. And I'm like, well, I've got no training in that, right? I'm not even court certified. And they're just desperate to try to figure out, they just need a warm body. We'll bring somebody in,
Good enough. Right.
right? And it's not. We need to make sure that the person brought in is qualified, has expertise in that field, in that setting. And that's why I can't emphasize enough, right? Education, in the medical field or the deaf-blind community. Those are my areas of expertise. And so that's where I stay, and that's where I've been working. Now, if I wanted to do work in those other settings, then I would have to go back to school and pursue some of that training, to be fair to myself, to be fair with hearing interpreters I'm teaming with, and to the clients ultimately, to be in a place where I can contribute, and not actually deteriorate what's happening in the setting, right?
Yeah, I can tell you're a teacher. I can tell you know how to teach and say the things in the perfect way. So there's just so much you have to offer that people who want to become CDIs could learn from you and other CDIs that are out there. That they have the sign skills possibly. And language aside, I think there's just so much else. Soft skills, boundaries, knowing yourself. There's just so much else there that I imagine it's a very huge conversation to have among CDIs. Yeah, and hearing interpreters too. But yeah.
You're right.
Anything else you want to add before we wrap up here?
Hmm. Mm. I'm really excited about this podcast. I think this has been a long time in the making, right? So it's like, ta-da, Andrea's doing it. She's the one
See?
who's gonna, yeah, lead us
I'm gonna
there.
try.
Yes. Yeah. I do want to see a similar podcast around deaf interpreting and deaf
Same.
interpreters and
So
still pull
Don,
in, yeah.
Don's got to do it.
Well, I'm learning from you now, right? I'm picking up tips so I can have a new podcast. I can be a podcaster. I always thought that would be a cool job to be a podcaster. I enjoy podcasts myself. The ones that I've seen, I've learned a lot from. And so I think, oh, we could apply that to this as well. And I want to see a lot more self-care. I mean, that's sort of my big thing. I really enjoy, taking care of myself, enjoy finding different ways that make me just a better person, better at my work. And that's something that I want to share with the community. Um, that's something I want to see more of. So down the line, I'm going to be talking more about that.
Yeah, I always want to emphasize that we can't do our job at an assignment well if we aren't well. Like we can
Hmm.
have those bad days, we can
Hmm.
withhold that information, do our job, stay on. But if it's every day you're suppressing all of that stuff, you just can't. That's where
Yep.
burnout happens, all of that. That's a whole other episode that you
Yep.
actually can come back and talk about because seriously, another aspect and layer to this work.
For sure. Well, thank you for doing this, Andrea.
Thanks so much for coming and chatting. At the end, I always ask guests to highlight or spotlight a deaf business or deaf organization that you enjoy. So I suppose who do you want to spotlight?
I mean, there's
I
so
know there's a
many.
list.
Yeah, I just want to support all of them. It's like, oh my gosh.
Austin, I
I've seen,
mean,
oh yeah, in Austin. I think someone counted recently 40 deaf-owned
40?
businesses in Austin. I know,
Wow.
from restaurants to you name it. Um, Catering services, coffee shops, massage therapists. Oh, and that's actually who I would spotlight is massage service by a deaf therapist, whose name is Amy Blanchard. Wait. Let me get that right. Blanchard. Amy Blanchard. And the name of the business escapes me. I can text it to you, and you can add it into the show notes or
But
whatever.
massage.
Yeah, massage services and absolutely interpreters need to be
Need.
consumers need, right? Massages. I mean, that's where we need to be. And she's amazing. Just little things that you can do for yourself to support deaf businesses as well. And then are also a part of taking care of yourself. And so I would spotlight Amy
Yes,
Blanchard's
Amy
interpreting
Blanchard.
or massage
Beautiful.
service.
Yes. Thank you so much, Don. Excited for
Yeah,
folks to hear your perspective. It's good stuff.
for sure. Well, thank you for hosting me. Thanks. Bye.